We're going to now hear from Kara Dansky.
We're here to talk today about what WDI can be doing in the fight to protect the sex-based rights of women and girls and what success might look like. I really think that radical feminists bring such an important voice to the entire conversation about stopping the abolition of sex. In the US, it is mostly only conservatives who are permitted to speak on the topic at all in the mainstream media, though, as many of you know, some radical feminists have been able to speak in conservative media as well. The mainstream media will not touch the topic or platform radical feminists who bring a leftist critique of gender identity to the conversation. But at some point, that has to break. Polling overwhelmingly shows that Americans across the political spectrum are with us. Everyone understands that men aren't women and that children shouldn't be sterilized. But, and I think this is crucial, so many left-leaning Americans are afraid to speak out because they think they'll be painted as conservatives, and they don't want to be associated with conservatives. I think this is a completely understandable concern, but it's wrong. If left-leaning Americans could hear from radical feminists, they would completely understand where we're coming from, and they would totally support what we're doing. It's partly with that in mind that I wrote my new book to be published in the next couple of weeks, The Reckoning: How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. I'm just going to read the text that will appear on the back cover. In The Reckoning, Kara Dansky, a radical feminist and lifelong Democrat, exposes the invasion by men into female-only spaces, the harming of children, and the silencing, punishment, cancellation, and even violence against women who speak out. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party, which claims to represent the interests of women, ignores the problem, while its allies in the organized left and mainstream media paint all opposition to the trans agenda as right-wing. But radical feminists are not right-wing. They are leftists who know that sex is real and are not afraid to demand women's hard-won rights to safe spaces and privacy. The Democrat left-wing establishment knows all the ways in which gender identity harms women and girls, and plenty of boys. Yet they are sacrificing women and children to a vicious, profit-driven industry that allows men to invade women's spaces and sports, denies that sex is real, and slices up children's bodies. Now the Democrats are facing a reckoning. Detransitioners are starting to speak out, clinicians are blowing the whistle, and women and girls, including many lesbians, have had it. Even now, the tide of common sense and decency is starting to turn in other countries that have banned harmful medical and surgical procedures for underage children, and a handful of Democrats are bucking the trend at the state level. Elected Democrats will later claim that they didn't know, that they couldn't have known, that the science has changed. But they knew. They've known all along. This book provides the evidence. So I don't want to say too much more about the book until it's published, but I do want to say that I talk a lot about WDI in it, and there's an entire chapter devoted to radical feminist organizing and activism in this area. So I look forward to it. And I shared it here because I hope WDI women will consider doing something similar in their countries. The main point is this: it is radical feminists, not conservatives, who can speak to voters on the political left all over the world, and we need to use our voices. So to that end, I want to say a word about anonymity, and I know this is going to be controversial. I know there are people on our side who absolutely cannot speak out using their own voices. These include especially the parents of minor children who are confused about their sex and trans widows, one of whom we heard from this morning. Both groups of people have completely legitimate privacy concerns. But for the rest of us, the tide is turning, and those who have remained anonymous are quickly going to find out that it is in fact safe to speak out. People, at least in America, are starting to talk amongst themselves about how insane sex denialism is. I want to encourage everyone who is even a little bit able to speak out using their own name to please start doing it. Our side is the popular one, and as more and more WDI women speak out, the more awareness we'll bring to our organization and the more cover we'll give to others on the political left who share our concerns to speak out as well. I recently attended the annual conference of the American Association of Pediatrics, which has been pushing child transition, not to participate in the conference itself, but to chat with some people who were there from the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. That group was founded to address problems of race in the US, but it has been increasingly speaking out about matters of sex and gender. With them that day were several detransitioners and Jamie Reed, a clinical worker who blew the whistle on the gender clinic she once worked at prompting a massive conversation in the US about the child sterilization that takes place at these clinics. All these detransitioners and Jamie tell me that they are so glad they decided to speak out. Clinician after clinician approached the table. I watched as the detransitioners told their stories, and I watched as Jamie explained to clinicians that just a few years ago, she was totally on side with child transition, but what she saw at the clinic horrified her. The vast majority of these clinicians were open, curious, and sympathetic. I'm serious when I say the tide is turning. I want to end with a quick story about what a WDI woman in the US recently did and encourage others to use it as inspiration for what they might do in their own areas all over the world. Carol Donzero is a second wave radical feminist and WDI USA volunteer who lives in the Seattle area. Last month, she spearheaded an effort to demand that the Seattle School District get so-called gender identity out of the school curriculum. Here's what she said at a school board meeting. My name is Carol Donzero, and I am here to deliver a demand for action to stop the promotion of gender identity ideology in Seattle schools. Those fighting the imposition of that ideology on children, including those presenting this demand, come from across the political spectrum. There are plenty of left-wingers like me. It is not okay to present children with blatantly false information about biology. There is nothing acceptable about telling them that some people are born in the wrong body, sex has nothing to do with anatomy, and men give birth. It is not okay to promote sexist stereotypes, undercut safeguarding, and encourage children to dissociate from their bodies. We are outraged that Seattle schools force children to embrace gender identity's mystical mantras and absurd new meanings for key words. We are outraged that it forces them to disregard the evidence of their own eyes, engage in compelled speech, and forfeit their rights to sex-based privacy and female-only sports. We are appalled that via misguided affirmation-only policies, teachers are locking vulnerable children into disassociation from their bodies, leading skyrocketing numbers to medicalization. Multiple systematic reviews have firmly established that pediatric sex change is not evidence-based. There is no there regarding supposed mental health benefits, but the harm to children is well established and massive. Seattle schools are complicit in one of the most horrific medical scandals of all time. I've prepared packets for each of you that contain the demand for action, an appendix that lays out what's been being taught, and an appendix that provides documentation for everything we say. The promotion of gender identity ideology in Seattle schools, the imposition of this belief system on Seattle's children, is hurting enrollment and creates major liability. The school board needs to act immediately because of these realities, but more importantly, because children deserve better. Gender ideology is anti-science, child harming, civil rights destroying, homophobia elevating deception. It is more than time to stop promoting it in our schools. So I share that because I really think it's a good example of how strong the radical feminist opposition to gender identity can be. We articulate our concerns with absolute clarity and absolute force. Carol and her team then submitted voluminous materials containing many references to the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. All of this material can be found on our website, which is www.womensdeclarationusa.com. If signatory after signatory brought this kind of message to their school boards and to elected officials, we would start making some serious headway. We know that schools today are incubators of gender identity ideology. If WDI can bring radical feminist opposition to that, it will be hard for the mainstream media to continue to ignore us forever. At some point, the dam has to break. My hope is that WDI will be a major part of making that happen. Thank you. In college, I really spent a lot of time studying core radical feminist texts, and I kept those books on my bookshelf, and my career went in a different direction. And then in 2017, when I woke up to this issue, it was because a radical feminist told me what was going on with gender identity, and I immediately got it. And that inspired me to pull down all those old radical feminist texts from my bookshelf and reread them. I got my Marilyn Fry, I got down my Mary Daly, my Catherine McKinnon, who Sheila and I are going to be talking about in an upcoming Radical Feminist Perspectives. And so it really, was inspiring me to do exactly what Joe said, which is we're not just going back to 2015. We're going to take this on a massive trajectory, and they're going to rue the day they came after us. And sort of on that note as well, there's a woman in the States named Elizabeth who spent some time thinking that she was trans and desisted from it. And it was the TERFs who she found. And so it was through that experience that she also found core radical feminism. And so she doesn't want to just go back to 2015 either. So I think it's really true. We're just going to take this far ahead. And then just real quick on what Joe said about the word TERF being a portal. So here's just a quick story. One day I was at a conference in 2018, and the conference was mostly political conservatives, parents who had children who were questioning their sex, doctors who were trying to push back against the medicalization of children, and me. And during the conference, I was sitting with some of the conference attendees, and we were just chatting. And I wasn't using that term to describe myself at the time because I thought it was a slur. And there's a woman across the table from me, and I don't want to say her name, but I would sort of characterize her as a moderate to conservative journalist. And she asked me who I was, and I introduced myself, and she said, "Oh, you're a TERF." And I wasn't quite sure how to respond because I wasn't using the term at the time, but I sort of said, "Well, yeah, basically." And she looked me right in the eye and she said, "It's the TERFs who are going to save us all." And I think there's really something to that. So the final chapter of my book, which is about us, it's about radical feminists, it's about WDI. The book talks a lot about Wolf as well, which I was very involved in before WDI. It starts with that story. And I think there's really a lot of merit to that, which is why they constantly shut us up and ignore us and why we have to keep talking.